Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore what I think is an exceptionally tricky question. What is the soul? That topic was suggested not too long ago by a viewer who goes by the name Jonathan Rabbit. So, tip of the invisible cap to you, Jonathan Rabbit, for that marvelous suggestion. Anyhow, I suspect that Mr. Rabbit asked me about the soul partly because of what I say at the end of my videos, which is, take care of your soul. So the question would then be, what exactly is it I'm asking you to take care of? After all, it's not necessarily obvious when you think about it. Anyhow, before we get started on all that, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. And also, as usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description of this video along with links to the timestamps. So, yeah, the question du jour is, what is the soul? Of course, at first that question sounds like a simple matter of definitions. And here's how Webster's defines the word. The immaterial essence, animating principle, or actuating cause of an individual life. But the thing is that how we view that immaterial essence can vary a lot depending upon how we see reality more generally. For instance, some of us define reality purely in terms of an objective, materialistic determinism, where reality is limited to what we can confirm through empirical investigation, which, of course, usually means scientific observation and measurement. Anything beyond that might be a matter of interesting conjecture, fantasy, maybe storytelling, but it isn't actually objectively real, and objective reality is the only kind that really counts. For instance, within the history of psychology, the famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner espoused such a view, which then led him to write a famous book entitled Beyond Freedom and Dignity. As the title suggests, from Skinner's perspective, freedom and human dignity are illusory constructs that actually inhibit our ability to recognize the hard, unyielding verities of life, which are always a matter of objective observation, evidence, and reason. Of course, from that perspective, the soul would be, well, a similarly illusory construct, devoid of objective reality, much like freedom and dignity. After all, we can't measure or quantify the soul. It has no length or width or mass, and when we try to observe it, say by way of a functional MRI scan, we can't even locate it in objective space, not even in the pineal gland, where Enlightenment thinkers like René Descartes said it was. And the ancient riddle that led us to posit the existence of the soul in the first place, which is the riddle of our mortality, basically the question of what makes a living body different from a dead one, is much more directly explicable in terms of the biochemical and histological principles that govern our physical bodies. So, from that point of view, the answer to the question, what is the soul, would simply be nothing. First, because there's no objective evidence that it exists in the first place, and second, because it's superfluous with regard to understanding the phenomenon of mortality. Or perhaps a somewhat more elaborate and sophisticated version of that same answer would be something like this. The soul is a linguistic marker of a fanciful story we human beings like to tell ourselves, a kind of unverifiable fictive construct we sometimes employ, probably just to allay our anxieties about the uncertain and perplexing nature of our own existence. But, of course, that's just one way of seeing things, even though in the West it's somewhat common. However, an alternative paradigm would involve inquiring into the nature of the soul phenomenologically, that is, in terms of our actual subjective experience, rather than trying to understand the soul through objective empirical observation, which very quickly ends up nullifying the entire question. And by the way, if you want to hear a little bit more detail about phenomenology, I'll put some links to a few older videos I've done about it in the description section of this video. But for now, it's probably enough to know that asking about the soul phenomenologically involves shifting our attention toward exploring the kinds of subjective experience that make us think we have a soul in the first place. In other words, phenomenological inquiry shifts the question away from trying to define the soul in terms of some set of essential properties and attributes, and toward exploring the regions of our experience to which the word soul refers. It involves shifting our attention away from trying to determine what the soul is and toward describing how the soul is. That is, toward exploring how it announces and manifests itself in terms of our subjective experience. Of course, the first obvious point of access for that kind of exploration would probably be to look at the experience of believing in the soul. However, I'm personally not at all convinced that that's really the best point of access. The reason is that it's entirely possible to believe in something, but without much of an experiential foundation that makes our belief feel deep and compelling. In those sorts of cases, our beliefs don't really amount to much, because their roots don't reach very deeply into the soil of our actual lives. In those sorts of cases, we may be able to convince ourselves that we really believe in X or Y or Z, but the fact is that we're not really feeling it, that it's not really part of us, most likely because what we're thinking of as our belief is really little more than our way of imitating and obeying what we've been told to believe. So the real question about believing in the soul is something like this. What are the kinds of experience that make believing in the soul something compelling and powerful in the first place, rather than just a matter of routinized political correctness? And to work toward a possible answer to that question, I'd like to draw on some of Abraham Maslow's insights into the nature of what he calls peak experience. For Maslow, peak experiences are some of the most intense and overwhelming moments we can have in this world. They include things like spiritual epiphanies, realizing the unity of all things, communion with God, experiences of deep transcendence, perceiving the miraculous nature of the world and ourselves, and so on. Of course, not all peak experiences involve a fundamental affirmation of the soul's reality, but the point is that some of them do. And without something like those kinds of experiences, all the talk about the soul is, well, really just that. Just talk, devoid of real passion and real significance. But on the other hand, when our sense of the soul is integrally linked to some sort of powerful peak experience, then the soul can become something genuinely important in our lives, something that can organize and make sense of a lot of our travels in this world. So at this point, let's focus a little bit more on the kinds of peak experience that would be powerful enough to do that, and compelling enough to convince us that we have a soul in the first place. What would those sorts of experiences look and feel like? Well, I'd say that their most important element would involve sensing that our existence is something deep. Basically, the act of realizing that we're not just a haphazard bricolage of two-dimensional surfaces, but that there's a kind of secret distance within each of us. Maybe it would help to think of it a little like the ocean. From high above the ocean, it just looks like a simple planar surface, nothing too remarkable. But underneath lies an incomprehensible vastness and beauty, its powerful currents teeming with untold life. And similarly, certain kinds of peak experiences allow us to see beneath the surface of our everyday lives into the hidden depths that lie within each of us. How each of us is a fathomless sea, endlessly ebbing and flowing along with the tide of time that surrounds us. So I'd say that the kinds of experiences that make us think that we might have a soul first have to do with perceiving the unexpected depth dimension of our existence. But of course, realizing our hidden depth in a world like ours can be a pretty daunting challenge. That's especially true insofar as our world seems to do everything possible to keep our attention perpetually focused on the outermost surface of things. You know, to keep us all fixated on being good producers and consumers on one hand, and to spend the remainder of our lives mostly oscillating between entertainment and boredom on the other hand. Basically, it's not necessarily an easy thing to reclaim our souls in a world like this one. An example. Let's say you go to a party this weekend and meet some new people. And because of our world's prevailing conventions, John tells you that he's a bricklayer, and Jane tells you that she's an accountant, and Eric tells you that he's a college professor. But then you meet Nicole, who tells you that underneath all of life's mundanity and predictability, she's actually an incomprehensibly vast and powerful ocean of soul, undulating languorously in the tropical heat of her sultry southern latitudes, slowly gathering force and momentum so that one day, maybe today, she might find herself cresting like an immense wave and then breaking like thunder upon the distant shoreline of an improbable universe. And the thing is that I bet you don't meet too many people like that, or too many who would describe themselves that way. But why? Why is it that the unfiltered language of the soul sounds so foreign to our ears most of the time? Isn't that a little bit strange when you actually think about it? Well, personally, I suspect that one of the biggest reasons has to do with power, and more specifically with the way power structures our perception and values. And the fact is that it's not actually in power's interest for us to become too familiar with the ways of the soul. That's basically because when we start to live our lives toward what we can truly be in this world, toward our own most potentiality for being, as the philosopher Martin Heidegger puts it, well, it tends to make us a lot less predictable and a lot less likely to obey our world's arbitrary edicts and commands. That's because when we realize how deep we really are and how incalculably vast the cosmos is, then a lot of the power games that our world takes very, very seriously seem, well, they seem pretty silly and petty and childish. And that realization has a curious way of inoculating us against some of the more obvious attempts to manipulate our perception and values. After all, when we have a sense for the real depth of our souls, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier just to laugh at any self-important tin-horn dictator who comes along to tell us how we should think, how we should feel and perceive, and what values are the appropriate ones according to his own preferred ideology. But the main point is that no matter how you slice it, power doesn't want us to have souls, at least not in any deep sense. And it definitely doesn't want us to learn to orient ourselves to the world accordingly. What power wants is for us to keep doing what we normally do, to continue construing the significance of our lives mostly in terms of satiating our most superficial desires, because that's the easiest way to keep us all running on the endless hamster wheel, which, just by coincidence, also keeps us perpetually enslaved to power's interests and agendas. To put it in the words of the late, great George Carlin, power wants us to be just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it without question. And by the way, that's a particularly nightmarish scenario for a college professor like myself, someone whose stock in trade supposedly has to do with nurturing the capacities of our minds. But maybe there's some solace in the thought that when we start to cultivate intelligence at the level of our souls, well, that's a whole other story. But, like I said, power doesn't really want that, and so it can be a pretty scary thing to have a soul in this world, which is probably another reason why it seems so alien to us a lot of the time. However, I suspect that the deeper reason is that recognizing the hidden depth within ourselves means that we aren't necessarily who we think we are, and that the reality of our existence is something very different from what we've been told. And for most of us, that's a very scary proposition. And so, to have a soul in this world means, perhaps above all else, finding courage within ourselves. The courage first to deviate from the prescribed norms meted out by power's interests, but also the courage to learn to walk along the edge of an endless abyss, to tread the hard cutting knife edge that separates the solidity of what we think we know from the boundless depth inside of us. That strange, unforgiving edge between order and chaos, between certainty and surprise. And because of all of that, it's a really brave and dangerous thing to have a soul and to care about giving voice to it honestly and directly in our lives, at least every now and then. But on the other hand, what else are we going to do that's actually worthy of our time in this world? In the final analysis, What's more worth experiencing than feeling like we're caught in the scary, exhilarating slipstream of the soul as it's pulling us inexorably toward the outer horizon of life? What's more worth our time in this very fragile and transient existence than developing a relationship with the infinite, with the transcendent, every bit as much as with the finite and the mundane? Because maybe all of the things we experience that lead us toward our souls are really nothing more than life's way of doing that. Life's way of asking us to balance the terror of being human against the wonder of it. So, to end this video, let's circle back to the original question for a few seconds. What is the soul? Well, to me personally, and I'm going to give you a really personal answer to this, the soul is, well, nothing special. And consequently, everything that's special. It's the voice in the wind that sometimes seems to whisper our secret names. It's the charming surprise of an unexpected smile. It's our desperate struggle to reclaim our sacred human birthright. It's the blood we spill along the road of life. It's the long shadow creeping behind us, the thing we try hardest to ignore. But the soul is also what calls us beyond ourselves, beyond everything that is petty and broken in our lives. Always waiting right alongside us through the long, long train of years, waiting with infinite patience, never faltering, never losing faith in who and what we are. The soul is, well, it's life's way of reminding us that all of our travels in this world are ultimately about returning to what's luminous and abiding, both in the world and in ourselves. So, at this point, I have a question for you. Why am I speaking to you in this ridiculous and irresponsible way, and possibly revealing my own soul in the process? Well, in case it's not already obvious, at the end of the day, the soul isn't something to explain. It's something to experience. And without that experience, we'll never even begin to understand it. That's why I'm speaking this way. It's because I'm trying to invite us all, perhaps myself most of all, to experience it. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul. All of you living oceans of transcendence out there in YouTube land, take care.